Hello and welcome live from Tehran. You've tuned into Press TV's World News. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, the United Nations calls on the Canadian government to begin meaningful dialogue with the country's Aboriginal leaders. The Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, James Anaya, says that talks should proceed in accordance with standards expressed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The indigenous communities known as the First Nations have intensified their protests against Ottawa's rights violations. They accuse the government of violating their basic rights and undermining previously agreed treaties. Prime Minister Steven Harper and leaders of some Aboriginal communities will meet on Friday to discuss the issue. Organizers are prepared to stage huge rallies on the same day. Well, switching over to Calgary, joined by Press TV's correspondent Joshua Blakeney. Hi, Joshua. Tell us the latest on what you have on this situation.
Yes, well, we know that Indigenous leaders have been alleging that the Harper government's decisions vis-a-vis the Aboriginal community have been in violation of Canadian law. Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution is unambiguous. It states that the Canadian government ought to recognize and affirm Aboriginal and treaty rights. So we know that the allegation has been leveled by Indigenous leaders at the Harper government that its policies, and especially its controversial Bill C-45, has existed in violation of domestic law. Now the international legal question has been brought to the table with this UN Indigenous expert alleging that the Harper government's policies and laws that it's been enacting are actually inconsistent with international law. In 2007, there was a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was voted for overwhelmingly by the whole world. More than 100 nations voted for that in the United Nations, and only 4 opposed it. The New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States of America opposed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And of course, revealingly, those very countries themselves have the skeleton in the closet of having native populations who have been displaced and dispossessed and who live in privation and poverty. And so this piece of legislation, this international set of laws, has been cited by the United Nations in order to indict the Harper government.
Well, let's look at Friday with this upcoming meeting with the Prime Minister. How likely is anything concrete going to come out of that?
Well, I think there's a perception that the Harper government is in the pocket of the very resource companies that profit from the plundering and despoliation of the resources that lie under the historic territories of Canada's Indigenous peoples. And so we've seen in the past that the Harper government is willing to meet from time to time with the Indigenous peoples in this country, but whether anything will materialize is yet to be seen, and I think most people would say is unlikely. Of course, we know that the Harper government is very much aligned with Canada's Zionist community. Indeed, he meets with the leaders of Israel supporters far more than he meets with the leaders of the Aboriginal community in this country. And they're very zealously criticizing the leadership of the Aboriginal communities, lest the Canadian people embrace a kind of anti-colonial narrative, which is obviously antagonistic to Zionist interests. And so that plays into it here in Canada. Obviously, we're seeing on a daily basis in the Zionist-influenced media in Canada that the Indigenous leaders are being attacked and, being portrayed as the root cause of the problems of the Indigenous peoples in this country. And so many would say that it's quite improbable that the Harper government will make any tangible actions to support Canada's Indigenous people, lest he lose favor with the resource companies and the Israel lobbyists who support colonization for one reason or another.
Well, it seems, Joshua, this time around that the Aboriginals are trying to be even more aggressive to try to get their point across. I'm wondering really what will happen if there is no agreement and basically the demonstrations and the hunger strikes will continue. Any idea, if we've talked to some of the Aboriginal leaders, exactly what their plans are?
Well, generally speaking, the people of Canada are fed up with the Harper government. It was exposed that the Harper government got its majority in Parliament through fraudulent means. It's viewed as a fraudulent, illegitimate government. And so the Indigenous peoples in this country, their actions are symptomatic of a wider malaise in Canada, a wider alienation with the Harper government. And so the Idle No More movement can't be characterized as being solely native populations. It's the indigenous people primarily, but also their Canadian supporters who are disgruntled with the Harper government spitting on Canada's quite noble, comparatively noble history of a treaty system where the British imperial government sought to strike treaties with the indigenous peoples and extract their consent rather than doing kind of overt militarized genocide as we saw in the United States. And so the indigenous peoples aren't going to just lie down and watch these treaties which they've signed in good faith be torn up and shredded by the Harper government, who's often serving foreign interests as it is. And the Canadian people are proud of that heritage and aren't going to allow that to be defenestrated either. And so I think you're going to see a larger mass movement in Canada. And we do have an opposition party, the NDP, the New Democratic Party, which used to be the kind of third party in Canada, but now is the opposition. And they're standing side by side with the Idle No More movement and championing their concerns in the Parliament. And so I think many Canadians would like to see the ousting of this illegitimate and fraudulently elected Harper regime and the installation of a party that's more aligned with Canadian values, such as the New Democratic Party. It's not perfect, but I think many Canadians would say that would be a good outcome if we saw the New Democratic Party come into power.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Joshua Blakeney, for that update out of Calgary, Press TV's correspondent there. Well, continuing with other news now this hour, more signs of a rift in the British coalition government as the second minister quits in 1 week.